we can all be here together. Thank you all for coming.
Hello.
Hi, Dilip.
How you doing?
Madan, everyone needs no introduction. Recently named the Financial Engineer of the Year. Lovely ceremony I had you up a few weeks ago. And one of Peter's long-term friends, collaborators, and an amazing scholar on his own. So he's unable to join us in person today, but he will be speaking as well as Bruno Dupuy afterwards for this conference. So please let's welcome him and proceed. Thank you.
Now, do I share my screen or how is it going?
That's probably best.
Probably the best? Okay. And here we are. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, let me put it on full screen mode. Okay. All right. So as things go, Peter and I have been building option pricing models for a long, long time. Starting with the variance gamma back in 1998, going on to the CGMY model after that Elliot will be speaking about. And then in 2000, and actually it was 1 or 2, we built the Sato process model. And that was getting applied, and I was not allowed to publish it for about 5-6 years. And finally it appeared in 2007. And just a few days before Peter passed away, we were at a meeting discussing time changes to Levy processes. The Sato process that we built in 2007 was a space-scaled change of a Levy process. And so the discussion went on as to which of these two one should look at. And the result was this paper that I'll speak about. Of course, had Peter survived, he would have joined and been a co-author on this paper, but that didn't happen. But in any case, his memory is very much in the work that's going on here. So let me begin here. I will speak in general remarks on additive processes. The Sato process was an additive process. The time change process that Peter and I were talking about before he passed away was an additive process. And so there's two kinds. And I'll basically comment on why we should be looking at them and what we can do with them, and what role the two different pieces play. So I'll make some observations on the elasticity of variance, and then I will introduce a bit more formally these two ideas of space scale and time changed components of additive processes. And the structure of the two is very different. The time change process doesn't look at the past very much. The space scale does. And we'll see the different roles they play in different parts of the surface. The space scale process I really call a perpetual motion process, and I believe that's an important attribute of markets in the sense that if there was no news coming out, the market would still be moving. And so they move on their own motion, new information, whether it comes or not. And then there's some remarks on the relative contribution of these two and which part of the surface they contribute to. And after you do that, then the question is to build models that incorporate both types of additive structures. And these are based on, in this paper, using exponential and gamma densities to model the elasticity of variance, or the term structure of the elasticity of variance. And once they're done, there are results that, okay, you just use the time change and you'll miss out on some things, or you just use the space scale and you'll miss out on other things, or you use both of them, and that gives you an 8-parameter, well, 12-parameter model, you'll see. There's 4 parameters in the time change, there's 4 parameters in the space scale, and there's 4 parameters in the underlying Levy process. Now, ultimately, we separate the positive and negative sides. We have separate processes for up moves and down moves. And if you put space scale and time change on the up process and space scale and time change on the down process, that gives you 16 parameters plus the additional 4 in the original Levy process gives you 20. And you'd wonder why one goes to 20 parameters in this business. Way back in 98, we were happy with 3. Peter and I were fitting the variance gamma model and marking the books at Morgan Stanley every day for over 10 years. That went on with the 3 parameters. But the markets are expanding and the number of options is growing. Those days, it used to be a few hundred. Now it's a couple of thousand. And the maturities we're trading now, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, to much longer maturities and also much greater depth in the strikes. Ever since 2008, the strike depth on the downside has exploded, gone from around 30% moneyness down to 50%. And so as the markets develop, as the contracts develop, one learns a bit more about how to organize the modeling, and the modeling here, 20 parameters is nothing in terms of coming to grips with 3,000 options. Now, to lay the groundwork as to where these things go, let me begin with just observing that we know with the absence of arbitrage that there's a risk neutral density at every maturity, and that density has a variance of the log price at that maturity. And in the old days, when we were with variance gamma, it was a process of independent increments, and it was a Levy process, and the variance would be proportional to time. And it doesn't take long in checking with data and computing the variance at different times and looking at it that you can rule out a Levy process because the variance is not proportional to time. And a better structure was to use space scaling, which is essentially what we did with the Seto process. We basically used for V of t, t to the alpha, okay, some power of time. And so that gave you a power scaling of the space variable. And of course, this will accomplish the task of giving you an arbitrary variance curve at each maturity. So you can get variance curves with space scaling, a Levy process at unit time. Alternatively, what Peter and I were discussing a week before he passed away, essentially, he was working and commenting and looking at time-changing Levy processes. So both these operations will deliver an arbitrary Wald curve. And of course, the Wald curve you can observe. And so you might ask, should I do one? Should I do the other? Should I do both? Now, of course, if you use Brownian motion as your underlying process, the two are equivalent and it's the same thing. So there's no difference. But in general, for most of the processes we worked with most of our lives, these things are different. And so the question arises, how we put them together. Now, in terms of general structure of additive processes, one just has to note that markets are perfectly capable of quoting forward starting options. And when they do that, they're giving you the distribution of future returns right now, consistent with the marginal distribution at each maturity. The end result is an additive process. So the markets, when they fill in all those prices, are giving you an additive process. So it's perfectly natural and reasonable not to tie your hands onto a Levy process, which has the long variance structure, but to look in general at additive processes. And when you look at those, we recognize that, okay, back in 91, Seto showed how to build a additive process from scaling a self-decomposable law at unit time. And it was Levy and Kinchin that had completely studied those laws. And we went ahead and did those things with what we call the Sato process. Now the issues are coming as to maybe combining space scaling with time changing. So I said, let's take a look at what one can call the elasticity of variance, which is just a logarithmic derivative of variance with respect to time. This thing can be computed arbitrarily, where you just go to options at maturity in the neighborhood of t, and you estimate the v of t curve and take its logarithmic derivative. And you can do this at the front end using a couple of maturities at the front end, or the back end using maturities over there. And so you can take a look at how the elasticity of variance is moving around. And the idea of focusing on elasticity is, of course, we recognize that 1 month in 60 months is not the same thing as 1 month in 2 months. Okay. So this gamma t function, you can approximate it from data on option prices, and we did that. Or I was doing it, looking at, this is joint work with King Wang at Morgan Stanley, and we started looking at these things. And we took data on SPY options for 1,000 days, 4 years, covering 2018 to 2021. And you can estimate the elasticity of variance using the first 5 of the last 6 maturities. And in keeping with time, I'll just briefly show a picture. At the front end, the elasticities are typically greater than 1. At the back end, sometimes they are lower, but they may go below 1/2. The thing with elasticities being above 1/2 is that implied volatilities go to 0 as maturity goes to 0. When they are below 1/2, implied volatilities go to infinity. And Peter was always interested in what implied volatilities are doing as maturity goes to 0. It's one of his favorite topics. And he was particularly interested in when they would be constant. And the thing is that for them to be constant, prices have to go to 0 exactly like the square root of t. So that's going to be a knife edge situation. Typically, when you look in the data, they're either going to infinity or going to 0. Typically, in normal times, they're going to 0 when these elasticities are greater than 1/2. Then when you come here to March 2020 and the onset of COVID and stress times, that's when they go to infinity. And in fact, we'll see that they tended to do that for quite a while after the COVID period. But before the COVID period, they were going the other way. And you can even look at term structures by basically computing at the money balls and trying to look at the term structure of variance or the elasticity of variance. You can get the variance and then take its numerical derivatives and build some ideas of the shapes they have. And you can see all kinds of shapes coming down, humped decreasing or humped increasing to start with. And so there's a variety of shapes, and the models we build are going to accommodate these shapes. Okay, so now we say, okay, we're going to look at doing both things. We're going to space scale with a deterministic function g of t, and we're going to time change with a deterministic function f of t. And the question is, how are we going to work out what the elasticities of f and g are? And a simple calculation shows us that if you take the curve for the risk-neutral mean, m of t, and you take the curve for the risk-neutral variance, v of t, and you compute the logarithmic derivatives of v and m, then from those two sets of logarithmic derivatives, you can recover the logarithmic derivative of space scale and the logarithmic derivative of time change. So both components can actually be recovered from data quite nicely. And so it tells us that, you might want to allow for both and look for both. And so we basically, used GPR, Gaussian process regressions, to build smooth functions of m of t and v of t, and then take derivatives and understand what the components look like. And then you can even draw graphs of the shapes of space scale and time change. And instead of spending too much time on those graphs, I'll just point out that typically what you have is space scale elasticities start at some level and go towards 0. Time change start low and go up to some level. So basically time change works on the back end of the option surface and space scale works on the front end of the option surface. And if you look at the ratio of the arrival rates of space scale and time change, then you can see that when X is large or when T is small, the arrival rates of space scale dominate time change. And the opposite holds for small x and large t. So you can see how the different size and time points are playing a different role using space scale and time change. Now, to understand more the fine structure of space scale and time change, I say you take a look at the signature of the self-decomposable law. The signature of a self-decomposable law is the function h of x, which is mod x times the Levy measure. And by construction, it is decreasing for positive x and increasing for negative x. And so ky is a proper Levy measure. And you can construct two processes. One is time change y using the elasticity of G. The other is time change L using the elasticity of F, and then space scale both with G. And then you can show that your joint process of space scale and time change is basically a combination of A and B. Understanding a bit more, you can say, let's suppose there is space scale. So we have the G is there. And then you can show that the whole process, A plus B or your X, is a space scale of a process W, where the process W is the solution to an OU equation, where the OU coefficient is the space scale elasticity of variance. And it is driven by a Levy process that is made up of the signature process of self-decomposable, time changed by the space scale elasticity, and the Levy time changed by the elasticity of the F process. And so you see that as long as the space scale is present, you have the OU structure, and the OU structure is basically giving you your perpetual motion. Basically, if dz is 0, dw is not, because it's going to be responding to past levels or the effects of the aggregated past shocks. So this is why I call this a perpetual motion process. And with the G and with the two elasticities present, we have this general structure. And if you look at incremental variances, you see that, okay, the ratio of space scale to time change is proportional to twice the ratio of the elasticities of the two functions. Now I come to modeling the elasticity of variance in a generic way. To model it, it's very simple. You say, let's start at A, let it finish at B, and let h of t be a distribution function on time. So h of 0 is 0, h of 1 is 1, and h is a distribution function. So you're going from A to B with your elasticity. The elasticity is going from A to B. Now your distribution function, you can use an exponential, or we use a gamma. So you can say that the elasticity of variance is going to be just given by an exponential distribution function or given by a gamma distribution function. The first one is completely monotonic. The second one allows for humps. And so the humped structure comes from gamma distribution elasticity of variance. Now, of course, you have to construct the F and G functions back from the elasticities. And for the exponential, it's fairly straightforward. The deterministic function of time that you need to use for the exponential case is just in terms of exponential integral. For the gamma process, the solution is in terms of 2f pfq, the confluent hypergeometric functions, but just the 2f2. And these are easily accessible, and one can work with them. Now you have to, these are your time change processes, one for space scale, one, you can time change and space scale. You can use either one of these for space scale and time change. So what we did was to either use just exponential or either use just gamma. Didn't do mixtures of them. However, there has to be an underlying Levy process that you're going to time change. And so that underlying Levy process these days, variance gamma was the one we worked with in 98. And variance gamma we knew was the difference of two gammas, and it was 3-parameter process. But we also knew that it is a difference of two independent gamma processes. And it just gave the two processes the same speed. Recent research has shown us that it's not good to use the same speed. Basically, the markets, I say, take the escalator up and the elevator down. So the speed up is fast, but the scale is small, and the speed down is large, and the speed down is slower, but the size is greater. So the markets have that characteristic feature, and so we basically use the bilateral gamma model. And so the bilateral gamma model is a difference of two independent gammas. There are speed coefficients and scale coefficients. BP and CP are scale and speed up. BN and CN are scale and speed down. Characteristic function is well known. Levy measure is available, and so is the density actually. And then the nice thing is that it's a 4-parameter model, which recognizes that, there's a mean and there's a variance, but there's two means and two variances. There's a mean up and a variance up, and a mean down and a variance down. Diffusion forces you to just think about one variance, but in actual markets, there's two of them. And you can basically map the 4 parameters of the bilateral gamma to the first 4 moments of drift, volatility, skew, and kurtosis. And these are analytical expressions for that. Then we estimated the model with just time change. And I'll just point out that the estimation errors were substantial: 6.5, 5.5, 7.5. Typically, when models are giving those kinds of errors, we basically say it's not a model, okay? Then we then put the time change, and here is the thing about the initial and terminal elasticities. In the early part, before 2020, the terminal elasticities were above the initial. In the latter part, they were below. So you had backwardation in elasticities post the crisis, post the COVID crisis. Then we estimate the gamma time change. And again, the errors are not that low, but this is only time change. When you put the two together, the time change and the space scale, then the error structure comes down to 2% and 2.3, and so you get a much better structure of fit, and also performance of the model. And you can see that the space scale is working nicely, at the front end, and the time change is working nicely at the back end. And ultimately, we said, let's split the two sides, okay? And so we split the positive and negative sides. So you take the gamma process of the up moves and you space scale it by a deterministic function and time change it by a deterministic function. And the same thing you do with the gamma process on the downside. And so that gives you two, and if we just use the gamma distribution. And so with the gamma distribution, this gives you that 20-parameter model I was talking about that has both the structures in it. And the average percentage error in the fit is now near 2% and below 2% in many cases. So that performance, certainly, there's an improvement in that performance. And the basic principle that we're observing is that there is more backwardation on the negative moves, with the elasticity of space scaling variance falling further. On the positive side, there's little backwardation, but the backwardation only occurs with space scale. With time change, the elasticity of variance is rising on both sides. And so, given the 25-minute mark, I think I'm well in my limits. I don't need to spend time concluding here. The basic story is that both space scale and time change make contributions. in terms of understanding the elasticity of variance in option surfaces, and they can be recovered non-parametrically as curves, and then they can be modeled using simple models based on the gamma distribution to allow for humps. And with that, I'll close and take questions.
Thank you so much, Dilip. That was fantastic. Anyone have any questions in particular? I would like to ask a question if no one has one. Obviously, we're talking today about the Peter Carr's legacy. And Dilip, I'm wondering if you can help us to understand, what can we take away from this? It seems like a nice new way to understand the behavior of volatility, particularly near expiration. But what will this mean, do you think, for the professionals and for the markets to have this kind of an understanding?
Well, I mean, the question about, it's, I guess, gives you some direction on the way in which you're going to handle the modeling of cliques and stuff like that, because those are all based on additive structures.
So do you think that investment banks will be, or hedge funds will be looking to this as an alternative for?
Well, no, I mean, that all depends upon, because everything that's used is contract specific, okay? So for certain things, I mean, people trading just stocks don't need to worry about it. People trading vanilla options at fixed maturities don't need to worry about it. You start studying more complicated contracts where you are making assumptions about forward return distributions, and then you might want to look at it.
Okay, so for some of the more complex products and the particularly volatility sensitive instruments, this could be an innovative way to look at how they behave and how they should be priced and risk managed.
Yeah, and how to get a read on their risk management, or at least the term structure of their risk management.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. Any other questions? So were we able to hook up Bruno Dupierre? We're still waiting?
Dave?
Yes.
This is Leon. Hi.
Hi, Leon. Where are you?
Hi. I'll be in tomorrow, but I came down with COVID beginning of the week, so I couldn't make it today, but I'll be there tomorrow.
I had the same issue, but how are you going in with COVID tomorrow? I'm not allowed to go in.
I'm 5 days post, fever free, 5 days post development of symptoms. That's the protocol.
I'm 5 days posted too.
Oh, well, hopefully I'll be able to come tomorrow. I'll see.
Yeah.
But I have a question for you, Dilip. A very basic question. So you alluded to this idea that in reality, the variance of the log of the price doesn't grow linearly with expiry, right?
Right.
But if you go back, it's way back in the 1980s when they first recognized that they had to build, term structure models for volatility, right? Like I'm looking back to, the basic models, Black, Derm, and Toy, where you had a time structure.
Okay.
Right? So did they not look kind of more systematically at what that exponent was when they first looked at the idea about volatility not growing linearly?
I think that even in 2002 and 4 and 5, we were happy with just a power function. And it was fitting the surface fairly well. But the markets have expanded. You didn't have that many options trading. You didn't have that many maturities, and the maturities were far apart.
So you're saying that if I simply specify an exponent, right? You can write down.
That won't work now.
Yes, but my question is, if you specify an exponent, can you sort of write down basically? I mean, why can't you write down a standard diffusion process that produces that exponent? That can't be done?
Oh, no, but I mean, that's not of interest to me because I want to fit the whole surface as well and then across all the strikes.
Yes, right. Okay.
Okay, I'm not just interested in the wall curve. No.
I understand. But I mean, they were looking at this.
If you want just the wall curve, you could do that. Yeah, that's a simple exercise.
But did they kind of say to themselves, oh, there's actually an exponent that better represents the profile rather than linear? Were they aware of that? Was that in their consciousness, so to speak?
I would think that things like CEV models are sort of playing with that idea. constant elasticity of variance models.
I see.
So, back then when you had scant information, and even now, if I want to look at options in the neighborhood of 3 months, say, I would use the power function then. That's what the elasticity of variance is.
Yes.
I mean, it's a
but-
power function. It's a local power function. It's just that if you want to go across from 2 days all the way to 2.5 years, okay, that you observe differences in the power.
Right. It's unrealistic to believe a certain single power will work across that entire range of expiries, you mean?
Yeah, that's
right.
a too big a range for it. Yeah.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Sorry, David.
Yeah, that's fine.
I sort of know where Leon came from. I guess we have our web audience here as well. So is there anyone else in the web verse that would like to ask a question of the speaker? Okay, great.